It's party time in Sunday school this week. Hey, every week is a party, right? Well, every week is a celebration. Every time we worship on a Sunday and go to Sunday school, it's Sabbath worship. So always a special occasion. But our lesson here, this is an interesting one. All the times that I've been keeping track of Sunday school lessons, this is a first, and I think it's really a good one, an important one. We look a little bit at the liturgical calendar of the people of Israel. So, liturgy is a word for practices of the church, practices that are intended to teach something. So, even in our worship service, all the things we say and do in worship, the liturgy, it's with a design so that we are formed as God's people. The words we say in church, that's the liturgy. And the church year is a liturgy too. Why we have a season of Advent and a season of Lent and a season of Easter and Epiphany and Pentecost, not in that order. But anyway, the people of Israel had a liturgy, they had a rhythm, they had a pattern to their lives. It was a weekly pattern which culminated in a Sabbath festival every week from sundown on what is our Friday night to sundown on their Saturday night was a time of rest and worship. And and so that was on the week, and then the rhythm of the year, you would have these days long, sometimes week, 8 day long festivals. There were three major ones in the history of God's people. Two of them are covered in our Sunday school lesson. The one that's kind of left out is the Festival of First Fruits, which actually became the Pentecost festival. So there's only so much you can cover in a week. So they actually, the reading covers the weekly Sabbath, the Passover festival, and the Festival of Tabernacles, also known as the Festival of Booths. These festivals sometimes had more than one name, which can be a little confusing, but we'll roll with it. Let me talk a little bit about each of those three things then. So, first of all, the weekly Sabbath festival. This is probably the one you know the most about, one that we seek to approximate in some way today. Although, if you've heard things, some of my sermons the last year or so, I lament the loss of the Sabbath as I mean, in culture is one thing, but for Christians, the loss of the Sabbath in our context, in our culture, has been, I think, devastating to the mission of the church, to our own health and well-being, our mental health, our physical health. But I digress. What is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is a day of rest. God made the world in 6 days. He rested on the seventh day. But what is rest? The word rest is short for restoration. If you take time to rest, you are restored. If you just keep going and going and going without a break, you uh, fall over dead sooner or later. You need that time of restoration, replenishment. Fascinating, though. I mean, if you do a deep dive into some of the Leviticus here, the Sabbath was even for the land. You know, every 7 years you're supposed to leave the land fallow, which is something that farmers learned in, and even farmers who didn't read the Bible figured out, like, if I don't plow and plant this field every year, things if I give it the land some time off, things are better. Um, so this time of restoration, what is it? Well, it's a time to not work, but it's not just about not working. What are you doing during that Sabbath? How are you replenishing? So the there are two places in the Bible where a Sabbath rest is commanded. One is in Exodus and one is in Deuteronomy, where Moses gives commandments and says, take a Sabbath. The fascinating thing is he gives different reasons in each of those places. In the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy have different reasons why a Sabbath. On one occasion, Moses says, you take a Sabbath because when God made the world, he rested on the seventh day, so you follow God's example and you rest. The other time, though, Moses says, you take a Sabbath because you didn't have one when you were slaves in Egypt, and now you're not slaves anymore. God has brought you free from Egypt. Remember that God has saved you from slavery, and the way you remember this is by not going back under slavery, taking a day. You don't have to work anymore. You're not a slave. The fascinating thing, so two I'm not going to say completely different, but not the same reasons for taking a Sabbath day, for taking a day of rest. They're both valid reasons, but the other thing is they both point to, in their own way, the two great themes of the Bible, the two great themes that we see in maybe the first two articles of the Apostles' Creed: God working in creation and God redeeming us from sin and death and evil. So the seventh day rest, because God rested on the seventh day, harkens back to God's great work in creation. And then taking a day off allows us to remember that God provides for us through that creation. The reality of the created world still resonates with us today. The world God created still takes care of us. God didn't just create the world and then say, all right, see you around in a few thousand years. No, God is intimately involved in the daily creation, and he is the one providing our daily bread every day from that creation. So the Sabbath is an occasion to reflect on God's marvelous work in creation and his provision for us. It's also a day to remember we're not slaves anymore. God has set us free, not from the Egyptians in our case, but from the devil and from our own sin due to the saving work of Jesus Christ. So we're going to take a Sabbath day to do what? Recognize God takes care of our bodies, recognize that God takes care of our souls. What are we going to do on the Sabbath day? How do we celebrate the Sabbath day? Actually, I think not working is a good approach. Now, in my case, I actually work on the Sabbath day. No way around that, I don't think. But what kind of work we do, how we focus ourselves. And that's, of course, why worship is a central part of the Christian Sabbath, like coming to church, receiving the gifts that God gives to us, the means of grace we receive in the divine service, hearing his word, receiving his sacrament, being reminded of our baptism, and also being in the company of our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ for the mutual consolation and conversation of the brethren. So these are all reasons the Sabbath still resonates with us today. Once a year, children of Israel maintained a Passover festival. This was also a reminder of how God had saved them from the Egyptians. They had a special meal to commemorate the meal that the children of Israel ate on their way out the door in Egypt. They remember the sacrificial blood that was put on the doorposts. And of course, the entire Passover festival is just saturated with imagery that points to Christ, in particular his blood sacrifice on the cross, the Lamb of God who takes upon himself the sins of the world. So that Passover festival, we don't, no, we can celebrate it, but we actually have a better and more perfect fulfillment of that Passover on Holy Thursday into Good Friday. That's where we find the culmination of the Passover for us. Jesus fulfilling, and of course it was the Holy Thursday meal where Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper with his body and blood, was a Passover meal that they were eating. So that was the Passover, and again, a festival that still resonates with us today, although with greater clarity and finding its fulfillment in the saving work of Jesus Christ. The final festival, you probably know a little about Passover, Sabbath, but this one might be new. Festival of Tabernacles, aka Festival of Booths. This was a neat one, especially for those of you who like camping. This was the annual camping festival of the children of Israel, where if you had a house, you were rendered homeless for a week's time. Because I can relate to that a little bit. I mean, I still have a house here. You still see I got a background here. I have less rooms than I used to, though. But for now. But that was what the Festival of Booths was, a temporary living arrangement where people had to downsize. But it was kind of fun, like camping. You know, you had a tent. In this case, it was a booth, and they would make these booths out of tree branches and leaves. You know, those were the booths that they would live in. And often they'd travel to Jerusalem, and the city of Jerusalem would swell in population. People would build these booths on top of houses and buildings. And the purpose of the booth was to remind them of their ancestors. Notice the teaching component of all of these festivals. The Sabbath reminded them of a couple of things. The Passover reminded them of God saving them. in Egypt. And the Festival of Booths reminded them that God took care of them while they were wandering in the wilderness 40 days, and that God had taken care of their ancestors anyway, that he had provided for them even though they didn't have permanent housing. They had temporary shelter after temporary shelter for decades, and God took care of them and they made it, and they got to a more permanent home. However, the Festival of Booths also reminded them that they actually didn't have a permanent home even yet, even on this side of the Jordan, even though they're in the promised land. There has been fulfillment of God's promises, and yet the future home still awaits. All of us die. Unless Jesus comes back, all of us will die. What does that mean for our house today? That means our house is a temporary living arrangement. The Festival of Booths reminded God's people that they were always under temporary housing. What do people in temporary housing do? They rely upon God to provide for their daily existence and daily needs. Let's never lose sight of the fact that this life, this world right now is temporary. We're hoping, longing, waiting for something more. As we wait, the Lord is providing for us. He's providing for us in these temporary shelters that we have right now. And how is he providing? Again, the two great themes of the Bible. He continues to, if not rain down manna from heaven like he did for his people long ago, he does give us daily bread in many and varied ways. But he also provides for every spiritual need we have through Jesus Christ, who became, one of these booths himself. Jesus tented among us, as John says in the first chapter of his gospel. Jesus did come into this temporary housing arrangement with us in order to take upon all the difficulties of living in a temporary housing arrangement, and in order to assure us of a more permanent home to come. I'm not sure we have any kind of even in our church here, an approximation of the Temple of Booths. Maybe we ought to get that started. Have every summer at Zion, we'll get out to a campground and be like, okay, we're giving up our houses for a week. You guys can get on that if you want to organize that. You go ahead. Otherwise, maybe just set up a tent in your Sunday school classroom sometime. Be like, okay, we're doing a Festival of Booths this week. But whatever the case, let's remember that this is temporary housing that we are living in. So let's see. What do our three great themes here tell us about? What can we pass on to our Sunday school kids in terms of our major themes that we always work on in Sunday school? The first question always is, what does the story tell us about who we are as God's people? Well, it tells us that we are valuable enough to God that he's going to take care of us and do whatever it takes to save us and provide for us in any circumstance, in any situation. It also tells us, and boy, the Sabbath really tells us, we don't actually have to have the pressure and the stress of thinking we need to save ourselves. We can take a whole day off and know that we're not going to die. The Lord is going to provide for us. What does the story tell us about the Lord and his tender mercies? We see in these festivals signs that point to the saving work of Jesus Christ. The Lord cares for us, these two great themes. He provides for us through creation. He redeems us from all sin and evil. And then finally, what applications? What do these stories tell us about how we live as God's people? It means we can party. It means we have occasions to have festivals. It means that there is a rhythm to life, but within that rhythm, there are times that would be beneficial to us to remember who we are as God's people and remember his saving work for us and remember the promises of what he will still do for us. So whether that's by following liturgical holidays on the calendar, or simply taking time throughout our days, weeks, and years to reflect upon the big picture. That's what it means. And I know the overall theme of the Sunday School month is praise and worship and celebration and joy, and certainly those are all components here of these festivals as well. That it is worthwhile to take some time to just thank God for who he is and what he does, Again, that big picture of his tender mercy and saving work for us. Blessings on your class this week.